Welcome back to Serious Talk, Agentic AI. I'm Greg Banks, your host. Thanks for coming along. If you've set up an AI agent, used it for a few weeks, and found yourself wondering why it feels a little less useful than it did on day one, today's episode has that answer. I'm joined by two members of our Serious team, Tim Harding and Gavin Franklin, who have been building and running their own agentic operating systems in daily production for months and have deployed them across our company. Today, we cover the difference between an agent harness and true agentic OS, the 3 tiers of memory most people completely miss, and the 4 core pillars every system needs to stay sharp over time. This is the first episode in a multi-part series, and there's a lot more coming. All right, let's get into it. All right, welcome to Serious Talk, Agentic AI. This episode is going to kick off a series we're excited to tell everybody about. We're going to talk about Agentic OS, about having a personal assistant, an operating system. And we've talked about it, and I've understood it philosophically, but last week I got one. I've drank the Kool-Aid. Tim and Gavin have got me on board, and I'm having a heck of a good time with it. But guys, good to have y'all here. I look forward to peeling this back today.
Yeah, really looking forward to it.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we're really excited about this episode too is just, this has just been something that we've been developing over time. And at this point, something that every one of our serious employees has now with their own personal assistant agent operating system and assistant operating agent kind of running their day-to-day lives. So something that's made a huge difference for us internally that we're helping a lot of customers with too. But people hear the term agentic operating system, then they hear Claude Code, they hear Codex, they hear ambient agents, they hear executive assistance agents, all the different terminology can kind of become really confusing. And so really what we're talking around here is, a few terms have kind of bubbled to the top in terms of talking about agents. And I think we've heard the term, agents, which we've defined many, many times before on this podcast, but then now agent harnesses. So a harness is being, the things around the agent itself that's providing it, the tools, the connections, the SOPs, the way it should, work and think, the way it interacts with with the user. And so we have the agent harness, but then there's this other term called the agent operating system. And I think that's even wider than the harness itself. That's more technical, the agent operating harness. And so that's what we're really going to focus on too, is how do we create, what is the key things to create an agent operating system? And what we mean by that is a maintainable, scalable way to work with your agent day in and day out over time in a way that manages the context and the tools and the access to the information that an agent needs to feel like a helper, to feel like it's doing what it's designed to do. And the key thing is over time. People talk about agent operating systems all the time, and it's great. You can have something work for a couple of weeks. It's a lot, but then you're going to have massive, if it's not a good agentic operating system, it's not operating as a system, you're going to find that over 3 weeks, a month, 3 months, now 6 months. I've been using my own personal agent Helm with his operating system now for over 6 months. And you're going to find that using these things over time, if you don't have the right agentic operating system, you're going to get context bloat. It's going to have access to too much or not the right information. Things get stale, and then it's going to actually degrade. It's going to feel like, hey, this is a great tool in weeks 1 through 3, and then it's going to feel a little less useful, a little less useful, a little less useful. So that's why you want the right agent operating system built on the best agent harness doing your work for you. So we've talked a lot about harnesses, agents before. Now we're focused on operating system. And so we're going to focus very high level today on hey, what holistically are the things you need to look at to kind of paint broad strokes around the different main components of an agentic operating system. And then because this is so important, we're actually going to do the next couple of episodes on this, diving into each kind of core pillar of an agentic operating system in much more detail. So want to give everybody a picture of what's all encompassing in an operating system, and then use the next couple of weeks as we release additional episodes of diving in of what does this actually look like in practice and what are some key things. But yeah, really excited for this episode. Gavin, not sure if you want to kind of add on your kind of flavor of agent operating system and how you see it.
Yeah, one of the consistent themes of these podcast episodes is I keep bringing it back to how AI is kind of reintroducing some of the themes that we've seen throughout computer engineering, computer science history, right? So when I think agentic operating system, throughout the last year as Anthropic and OpenAI and these LLM companies have released more capabilities to their models beyond just the power of the model, but also through the connectors and what they can interact with. Really, what we've come to today is beyond a harness. It is a higher level input output controller that also consists of managing memory, which to its core is two of the primary jobs of what you see an actual operating system doing on a computer. So we see that, the agent world is kind of transforming into being its own mini computer, essentially. And that's what we see when we have our helpers. We work with it. It's able to pull input. It's able to store memory. So it's an AI driven computer at this point and what it can interact with and what it can save.
Yeah. And I think I'd like to unpack what we mean by memory a little bit too, because I think people hear memory and then they think, oh, well, I've used ChatGPT before, I used Claude before. And a memory is when the agent says, oh, okay, I'm going to go and remember that, particular fact. And then it logs it in kind of its memory bank. Well, that's only one small slice of memory. Like at the end of the day, like those are very focused individual facts and they can be semi-helpful sometimes. I think people have seen if I use ChatGPT for a while, learns a little bit more about you, becomes, a little bit more useful. But memory is really stored data or stored information of anything that agent's encountered before and then stored in a structured way where the agent can then retrieve that to use later on. And so it's, structured summaries of all your meeting notes. It's structured summaries of all the projects that you're working on. It's structured current state of, your company and making sure that the agent knows what's current, and then it has some way to kind of move things out that are stale. So it's not kind of, getting, more and more degraded over time. And so, yeah, just memory is much wider than just, hey, the little memory feature in ChatGPT. Memory is everything that you're encountering, making sure you're not losing that. We lose things in our memory all the time as humans. So I always say, like, what would be one of the perfect superpowers? Like photographic memory. I always said, like, photographic memory is like one of my top 3 superpowers. If I ever was asked, like, that's one of the top 3 I'd want. And you can kind of get, somewhat, we're able to remember a lot more, get access to content a lot more with a good agentic operating system. So I just want to make sure, because the term memory is used in a different, couple different ways, going to share, we're using that in a much wider lens.
You have to kind of think of memory with agents in 3 different tiers, right? So you have your context, which is exactly what the agent is operating on in that specific interaction, right? So think of that almost like your random access memory or short term, everything that we've interacted with right now, that agent's going to remember. Then you have your long term memory, which is what we're talking about here. You're going to take things that are important. You're going to store it somewhere locally that the agent has access to. I would refer to this as agent memory, right? So you have memory that's specific to the agent itself, which is really powerful when you're working with a local agent. And then the third piece is could be agent, could be user, third party stored memory. A lot of times it's user memory. And what that means is the agent is reaching out with the user ID and storing important information somewhere and accessing it in the same way it would access agent memory. Very similar. Typically, that's some sort of shared agent was when you see that. So when you have multiple people working with one agent, when you're working locally, it works really well with something like an Obsidian Vault or any sort of local storage that the agent can jump in and access as its long-term memory.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. So I think in terms of introduction, I think that we've kind of covered high level what we mean by an agentic operating system. But what are some of the core pillars or components, just to kind of let people know kind of what order we're going to go through it, and then we can dive into each one of those from a high level to give an introduction of what we mean by each of those in turn. But what are some of the core pillars of an agentic operating system that people need to keep in mind as they're developing their own, second brain, so to speak, is they're working with these agentic systems?
Yeah, all the pillars are going to exist around context management when you think about it from an operating system perspective. So the first pillar is really going to be input and the signal layers. So how you get data into your agent. And this one is really, what are the inputs? What are the external sources of information you want your agent to have access to? And building it in such a way that each one is configurable and plug and play. And another important thing that I think of with signal layers is as you're building out an agent, it's important for the memory of the agent itself, the long-term storage, to be one of those signal layers, one of those inputs, right? So what the agent knew yesterday is almost more important than the information that you can draw from your external systems today. So we have that set up today within our agents that we use daily, to our project management tool, to our Gmail, to our calendars. We are a Salesforce company, so we operate out of Salesforce. We pull our Salesforce, we pull Slack. And then, of course, we pull in our internal agent memory from the day before. It kind of reminds me, one of the things that we do when we submit time, we realized when we tried to write time writing skills that it's around 50% usable time entries. But when we have it go back and pull last week's time entries, it's around 95% usable because it's able to pull all that into context. And it pulls our Gmails, it pulls our ClickUp, it pulls our calendars to get a full picture of exactly what we have.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think anybody in terms of when they're looking at signals, they're like, okay, well, what do I actually, there's kind of a big four right out of the bat that pretty much everybody's going to have, right? It's going to be email, whether you're leveraging Microsoft or Google, Outlook or Gmail for your email. It's going to be 90% of people there. Everybody's got a calendar. Again, same thing. Most people are either Microsoft or Google based, very easily accessible. Everybody's got meetings that are happening. Meetings are getting recorded, whether that's internal at your company. Even if you're working in the office, a lot of people still record your meetings, whether you're working virtually or working virtually with a lot of customers. Obviously, you're going to have lots of recordings. Those are kind of like the big three right out of the gate. Like if you can capture all your meetings, you can pull in all your calendar info, you can pull in all your email info. That's a huge start right there. Then you layer on a lot of the other common signal layers, right? A lot of people use some type of project management tool for their tasks or task management tool. A lot of people have a collaboration tool like a Slack or Teams, right? It would be really big examples there. So start with the big ones. Those are usually some of the easiest ones to connect with first, and then layer on in terms of amount of context. But what I've actually found is the amount of work of maintaining your operating system just goes down as you're able to bring in accurate context more and more. And so if you can just tackle the big three right out of the gate, meetings, email, calendar, just starting there gets you a really strong head start. And meetings are huge. Like you got to get your meeting context into your agentic operating system because you spend so much time throughout the day giving guidance or working with people, working through problem sets, sharing information. And if you're capturing that into your agentic operating system, that is just gold. That is all things you don't have to repeat yourself later when you're working with your agent. There's a trend becoming more and more common in the AI space called bot sitting. So sitting and just working with your agent, having to feed it context and correct it. Giving it the right context through the right signal layers from the get-go prevents a lot of that, because you're already doing a lot of things with people live. If you're capturing those transcripts and getting them in a right usable format, you can prevent that. So looking at the signal layers and really just kind of weighting them on impact and amount of context and chipping away at the biggest ones first, you can really save yourself a lot of time and just gain a lot of new opportunities in how to use the time you're saving yourself by doing that. So highly recommend starting there.
I would also say that with the signals, it's important, a big unlock for us as we continue to do development on our internal agents. It's important that we understand that one, these are inputs, they're also outputs, but they're their own line, right? So having something dedicated to pulling something from Gmail specifically, and then pushing that information into an aggregate. That way it's all, I don't want Gmail now, and you don't have to go in and change shared code across all of your input layers, right? So being able to break them up into individual feeds and being able to work and tweak at those individual feeds is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So we got signal layers as kind of the first pillar. What's next?
Yeah. So next I really want to talk about, once you have those signals, how do you use them? What's the flow into the system? And what that means is, how often am I pulling this data? The good thing is most of these are typically going to be ran through connectors, right? So Claude Code, Codex, they all have connectors now, which means that they can be pulled on demand, right? So you can sit within your agent and request data from your Gmail or whatever it is that you have connected, or Outlook, But essentially what we have found most useful is, even though you can pull on demand, and pull on demand is a powerful tool, it's better for your agent to just be aware of the context on a regular basis, right? That way, maybe you forget to add context to a specific session. The agent has it with it. So we typically operate on a model where you have some sort of nightly pool. And we operate off of a common operating picture memory model. So that's something we'll touch on more in the future. But we refresh those common operating pictures nightly. Additionally, we have daily notes where we may go in and say, give me my daily notes, and then it'll go and pull from some of those signal layers. Maybe not as in depth as the nightly refresh. You can tweak it as much as you want, because it's the difference between the aggregate and the actual input output side of the tool. And then additionally, you have per session. So this is where you have, I pulled all of the information into a common operating picture. My agent's working off of that common operating picture. I know I just met with somebody on that project. So I'm going to, at this exact session, have it update the common operating picture or update the session context with the most recent artifact that was generated from that meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things to think about here is not just sequence of your context, how it goes from one format to another onto your operating system and then to an output, but also lay it across time, because a lot of your context needs to be managed on a very particular schedule or routine, so to speak, routines if you're using Claude code, where, hey, I need to make sure my cops are fully refreshed before I can generate my daily note. And if my daily note starts to get generated before my common operating picture is generated, right, I'm not going to have accurate or up-to-date data, right? So you want to kind of map out across both in terms of process-wise, how do I take something from a brand new signal, get it into my operating system and ready to use for my agent, but then also what is the time sequence that needs to be there? How often do I need it to be refreshed? What sequence needs to happen for different actions I commonly do? So I'm always pulling from up-to-date information. So yeah, really looking forward to diving deeper into that piece. And then, so outside of the context flow, then what's the next layer we got to deal with?
So we dealt with the inputs. Now we have to deal with storing the inputs. This is where we get into memory management, the second half of the agent operating system picture. So like we talked about previously, you really have your session memory, right? So this is the real-time observations. It's very session specific. And this could be many different things. It could be skill files. It could be MD files. Working with the session, it says, I have a skill available to me. Let me load that skill in. And in itself, that is memory, right? To be able to understand that there is an action that it needs to take over and over again. You don't want to load the entire skill into context. You want to just give it a little description. And once it decides it's ready to use that skill, it loads it from memory, right? So all of that, once it makes it to the session, it becomes session memory. It's pulled all the way to the front of the user. Additionally, you have memory banks. So this is the long-term storage. So as you're working with the agent, it's important that you have your high-level Claude MD file, your high-level agent file for codecs. Reference the fact that it should be looking to store memory configured to however often you want that to occur, right? So it could store things like user preferences and patterns, or you could tell it, I want you to store this project context, whatever it is you're working on, into memory. So it'll then go into its memory. You have to organize the memory in such a way, which is something that we're going to dive into, that memory organization, in a future episode. Things like our cops, right? Things like projects. And it's going to say, where do I store that memory? It's going to put it in there long term. That way, when you go to open up another session, you can pull it, or it may even know to pull it just from you interacting with it and asking a question about that project again. And then the last thing I think is maybe the most important aspect of memory management is clearing memory. So you go from your long-term memory bank into a permanent archive, right? We don't necessarily want to delete everything. I mean, at a certain point, you're going to have to from a storage perspective, but the goal would be, let's have a scheduled job, a skill to actually be able to work with the agent to do this on a reoccurring basis, to look at your memory and convert it into an archive state. An archive memory session, archive memory is really memory you go straight, like You basically have to tell the agent, I want to go into my archive. I want to pull this memory. If there's something specific, that it's missing that's been archived. And then it makes its way back into the memory bank and restarts that cycle, right? So it's pulling up the various different levels, long-term storage, archiving, short-term storage, the difference between RAM and just regular memory on your computer. Very similar.
Yeah, and that's going to be an exciting one to dive into. There's just so many different things to think about in terms of the memory management piece. And then I think just one key rule, and we'll get to this when we get to that actual session, but just ruthlessly archive. Agents love holding on to as much information as possible because archiving it sees as like almost a destructive activity. So it's always going to err on the side of keeping more. And again, you're not just looking at something usable for the first couple of weeks. You want to be using this agentic operating system for months and years. And so having a mechanism where that archive is still accessible, so you can always go pull it back if you need to. But thinking through how is the agent going to determine what it can archive, what it can't. That's going to be a really fun session. All right. So then we got one more left. What do we got, Gavin?
Yeah, I think the other important thing when it comes to an operating system, very similar to a harness, is it has to be model agnostic, right? So there's no real reason why everything that we just talked about, right, shouldn't be able to be ported between Claude, GPT, right? Where things can get tricky is in those connections, those inputs, right? Typically, most of your LLMs are going to be able to operate off of some sort of vault structure, memory structure. That's a little easier to manage. When it comes to the connections, right, the best way, what we have seen, we kind of have a tiered system with those connections. The first thing we want to do is use out-of-the-box connectors with some of these tools. So Claude Code has their connections, for instance. It's important because they're secure, they're published by those companies that you're connecting to most of the time, and they're easy to use. So when it comes to model portability, that's really the one area where you have to look and say, okay, does the tool I'm switching over to have those connection capabilities? If not, do I look to go a more custom route? We've started leveraging password applications like 1Pass to store our credentials if we need to access something via API if it doesn't have a connection. You could even go custom MCP route if that's something you wanted to do. But those connections will be the most difficult part, but it's important that you're able to write your operating system, your aggregator from then on in a way that's completely model agnostic, whether or not you're utilizing Claude Code, Codex, or even some sort of custom tool. Your harness and your operating system should be able to survive that.
Yeah, I think you're just, by investing the amount of time and context that you're putting into an agentic operating system, even if you don't plan on switching harnesses or switching from like Claude to, Codex or you name it, right? You still want to have that freedom to do it because your true IP is going to be in your agentic operating system, which is how you get an agentic harness to work for you for your day-to-day life and business. And so that's where the true value is here in a world where there's a lot of very frontier level agentic harnesses. The differentiator then relative to other people leveraging AI is your agentic operating system that you develop for you or your team to be able to do your day-to-day work. And so building it in mind of, hey, I'm using it around this agent harness today, but I want to be able to carry this to other harnesses down the road, I think is really key because the longer you use an agentic operating system, the more valuable that OS is going to be both to you as an individual and to your team or your business.
Yeah, one other thing I'll touch on, especially from a business perspective, when we talk about agent building locally, you can absolutely think about it from a personal, I'm working and I'm trying to build my own little agent to accelerate my work or whatever, your personal life, whatever it is. But from a business perspective, one other thing that I think is really important from an operating system side is reproducibility, right? So the ability to then take that operating system and to send it out to the rest of your company. So what I mean by that is, what are the dependencies that your operating system might need, right? Is it Node? Is it Python? That's something that was definitely a pretty key piece in our development of our agentic operating system, is to be able to say, can we run this on startup, check for those dependencies, go through that download process. That way it's repeatable across the actual operating systems. That was a big one too, the difference between Mac and Windows, right? So
PC,
all things you need to keep in mind when you're going to develop an operating system from a business perspective.
Critically important because I think this is the piece that really where the rubber meets the road in terms of, okay, we got these great tools. We have some like really good MCPs or connectors, but how do we get this to actually like work on a day-to-day basis for months or years for our team? You've got to develop an agentic operating system. That's where a lot of the work is. And a lot of it's not necessarily technical work. A lot of it is just straight process work and thinking through your SOPs, how you do your business, what are the inputs and the outputs that make you and your team effective on your day-to-day basis. And what's exciting about this, though, is it's not only going to help make you more efficient at some of what you do today. That's like the mildly exciting piece. What the really exciting piece is just new capabilities that your team's going to be able to do that you weren't even able to do before due to the enhanced capabilities that you're going to have by having access to all this context with a really strong agent harness with a really smart human behind it thinking about how to use it for that job. You're going to find whole new things that you're going to be able to do with your teams in terms of outputs that you weren't able to do before. And I think that's the real unlock for a lot of teams.
Man, there are 1,000 analogies listening to you two talk about this that come to mind. And I just think back over a 30-year career. There was a time in my life where I built Microsoft Access databases and wrote VBA. Later in my life, I learned how to do Excel spreadsheets. And maybe that's backwards to you why I did Excel after Access. But I got into there doing VBA and that, learning charting and all kinds of enhanced things there. Moved into Salesforce, did that for about a decade and a half, and certainly have had specialities that I built up over time. And the fact is, I can't do any of those older things anymore, right? Those skills have kind of left me, so to speak. So as I think about you guys talking about this, imagine you were going to hire an assistant and you've been doing a job for 10 years and now somebody's going to help you. And you want to sit down and tell them all the things they need to know to be an effective partner with you. How do you organize those thoughts? You don't realize how ADD you are until you actually start trying to dump 10 years out. And that was what I found as I got my agent. I started thinking through, what about this? What about that? And I didn't realize throughout just a day how many times my brain context switches across things. And I need the agent to be cohesive. So you guys thinking about from a corporate agent, right? There are things that are common for every single person here, to the tone we express to a customer, the detail we want to see in an artifact, the type of summary we want to meet, how we organize our time tracking. All those things are conversations that we can kind of define, set that as a skill, and universally every one of us is going to kind of try and do that thing the same. But other things that I do that you two may not do, I have the liberty to go kind of do that within my agent and do some things that make it really personal for me, bring my personal tone and experience to it. And yeah, the one reason we're going to do a multi-episode series here is we started talking about this topic and bringing it out there. There's so many things we've gone through that has really focused on the evolution of the tools, things that we've done in the past, like security, like token rationalization, all those things. Those rules still apply, to be really, really clear. You can't throw those out. But as we think about what does all that mean when you actually go make an agent, there's so many pieces and there's no way to do this in one episode. So we were just trying to find a meaningful way to break it down. So unfortunately, you're going to have to wait a couple of weeks to get the next episode on this. But there's going to be some really good things here that are going to be applicable. And if you haven't started this process, look over the artifact behind the show notes in this. It's going to give some written examples and whatnot of what we talked about today. But really follow along the show. We're going to look forward to the next one coming out. We dig deeper and hopefully you can take this back to your team, talk about the plans you have for your personal agents and maximize the value you get from this. But Tim, Gavin, one, thank y'all for the work y'all have done. I believed in it the whole time, but until you sit down and use it, you just can't begin to understand the power of what this thing can do to help you throughout your day. So thank y'all for what you've done, but in particular for making this a way that we can service up to our listeners. This is not a simple thing to break down. And again, it's not just something we do as consultants. It's what we're doing here internally as a company for our users. So it's exciting stuff to see, more exciting to use. But we hope our listeners will come back for the next one. And if you've got questions on this specifically, feel free to reach out to SeriousTalk@SeriousSolutions.com. We can connect you for a meeting or be glad to follow up with you. But guys, thanks a lot. We'll look forward to talking to you on the next one.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to Serious Talk Agentic AI. Tim, Gavin, genuinely thank you. At the core of this, if we can't trust the work, then what's the point? This is where it really gets interesting. The number Gavin dropped early in the conversation stayed with me. 50% usable time entries without context versus 95% when the agent could pull last week's calendar, email, and Slack conversations before it started. That single data point makes the case for the Agentic OS faster than 10 minutes of explanation ever could. And Tim, you're framing that true IP lives in the agentic operating system, not in the model or the harness, is one that is easily missed if your efforts are not intentional and iterative. This is just the beginning, folks. We're going to go deep on each of these 4 pillars in the episodes ahead. Follow the show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss what comes next. If this was useful, a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast or Spotify makes a real difference in getting this in front of other practitioners doing this kind of work. The episode artifact and all the links are in the show notes. A special thank you goes out to Jason Fowler for use of his song, Mystery Road. You can find Jason's work at jasonfowlermusic.com. If you have questions or you want to go deeper, please reach out to us at SeriousTalk@SeriousSolutions.com. Thanks for coming along today.